has nothing to do with word conservation. It has to do with the internal logical coherence of our argument and the connections and the links. That's what we're going to have to access in order to deny and justify our denial. I mean, you can just deny, right? And sometimes you see sort of authors who, what I would say, take the easy way out, and they just make the denial and move on. Okay, great, you denied that, but why did you deny that? Right? Why did you deny that? What's your justification for denying that? It could be possible. So you need to be able to appeal to some internal consistency that legitimizes and justifies this denial. On an abstract level, whatever you write, irrespective of water conservation, know that when you appropriate the disjunctive syllogism, like when you appropriate the disjunctive syllogism to the rhetorical analysis or conceptual analysis, or even on a really geeked out level on your own brain mentally, so when you think and you see crap in the world, you should know that you're going to have to justify why you made that denial. No one's going to let you write. No one's going to let that write. Oh, you're just going to deny it flat out? Well, and then the next page is some new chapter? You're crazy. No, why did you deny it? Because you can rest assured that somebody wants to affirm it. Right? So you have to justify your denials. You cannot get away with just saying, oh, it's crap. Okay, so in designing this sentence I selected, this is part 1A. We attempted to regulate population growth. We attempt to regulate population growth, right? Either we attempt to regulate population growth. So we attempt to regulate population growth is in position part 1 of the disjunctive syllogism. So to occupy the position of D1, disjunct 1, you know that I will deny it, and that denial will require a justification for denial. So now you're already learning a lot more, right? You know that, you've learned quite a bit in 45 minutes, right? You know for a fact that insofar as I've selected whatever, X, to fill the position of D1 in my use of the disjunctive syllogism, that I'm ultimately going to deny that. You know that I did that deliberately, though. It wasn't arbitrarily placed in that position because I really want to affirm what is in position D2. So you can make two predictions based on the initial recognition of my use of disjunctive syllogism. One, Dr. Campbell is ultimately going to deny D1 some point later in his analysis, and two, Dr. Campbell is going to reaffirm whatever he claimed in D2 some point later in his analysis. And I will, if I use this, right? So part 3, we cannot, so the goal is to finally say, we cannot attempt to regulate population growth, right? That's the goal. The goal is to say, we cannot attempt to regulate population growth. But you can't just say that. You can't just be like, okay, well, you know, we attempt to regulate population growth, or we attempt to influence behavior. We cannot regulate population growth, therefore we attempt to influence behavior. You can't just say that, right? Why don't you? Why isn't it an appeal? And note, and this is the important point, right? Note that the denial, and specifically now with respect to my analysis, right? The denial of regulating population growth, it sounds evil, it's sort of genocide-esque, it could lead to all types of different conspiracy, hokey, blah, blah, blah. The appeal is not an ethical appeal. We don't care about ethical appeals in this analysis. It's not because it's the bad thing to do. It's not because you ought not to attempt to regulate. That is not a justification. That is not a justification. It does not qualify on any level at all. The appeal as to why we are denying it is not because, oh, we ought not to. There's no ought here. There's no should here. It is a logical denial. This denial is not an ethical denial. Please, people. And I see this, my pet peeves, my ultimate pet peeve, is people who pseudo do this logic stuff, right, in their rhetorical analysis, and they appropriate ethical claims to the negation. It's not an ethical thing. It's not that we ought not to. It's not about ought. It's not about what you should do or what you ought not to do. It's the negation of the claim. It's a consistency argument. It's about logic. It's about the integrity of the structure of the logic, of the reason. It has nothing to do with ethics at all. At all. At all. Now, that's not to say that, you know, your argument can't have ethics in it, but I'm saying that this is not an ethical argument. This is an argument from logic, not an argument for ethics. We let the ethicists deal with the argument from ethics, and it's an important argument that needs to be had, but this is not that argument. I'm going to be very clear about that. We cannot attempt to regulate population growth, right? The question is, why can't we attempt to regulate population growth? Why will this claim eventually be denied? Your response cannot be, in an attempt to justify it, because we ought not to. Because that's dogmatic. That's like saying, that's no different from evoking any religious claim as to why we ought not to. It's dogmatic. It appeals to itself. It's self-referential. Why ought we not to? We cannot attempt to regulate population growth. Why? Because it's bad. Okay, that's not an argument. Why? Because you ought not to. That's not an argument. Why? Because, the powers that be say that it's the wrong thing to do. That's not an argument as to why we ought not to. The argument, the response for why we ought not to, needs to be in the form of there is an inconsistency if you assume that position. You see this becomes an inconsistency, A and not A, right? You see this is why we select B, right? We're not going to do that. We're not going to do A because there's some inconsistency in the use and appropriation of A somewhere else in our argument, right? It does not fit in the logic of our argument. That's why we're choosing B, not because we ought not to choose B, right? Remember, this appropriation isn't just about the disjunctive syllogism in and of itself, free-floating in theoretical space. This is about the disjunctive is a hard word to say over and over. This is about the disjunctive syllogism in its incorporation into our logical argument. That's what this is about. And its consistency within that argument. So, obviously, you're going to need to justify the denial. And the justification can't be, because, it's the wrong thing to do, we ought not to do it. That doesn't count. That doesn't cut it. Top of page 22. Part 3 of disjunctive syllogism will require augmentation, and you know what I mean by augmentation now, to justify the denial of the disjunct. We have to answer the question why. A reader is going to expect us to say why we're denying it. You can do this or this. You can do one or two. You can't do one. Pause. Why can't you do one? You can't do one because this doesn't follow, this doesn't follow, I said this, I said that, because I said this, because I said that, because I said this, because I said that. You can't say this, therefore you gotta say that. That's what we're looking for. Not, you can do one or you can do two. You can't do one. Why can't you do one? Because it's the bad thing to do. It's just, it's not right. That's not an argument. It's not an argument. And I don't mean to sound facetious. There's some tier 1 ethicists out there, right? And I don't mean to have this sort of antithetical, antagonistic relationship between epistemology and ethics. I don't mean to do that either. But the idea is, right now we're doing logic, we're not doing ethics. And to appropriate ethics as a justification for the negation is a really weak argument. It's taking the easy way out, with it, rather than showing and demonstrating within the logic why we're negating something. You just say, oh, well, because you ought not to do that, right? So I don't buy those sort of logical, they're not even logical, I don't buy those ethical sort of justifications in and of themselves unless it appeals to the syntax and semantics of, more the semantics of the argument that's being presented, right? I don't want an outside sort of self-referential appeal. Justification for the denial of disjunct 1 in the disjunctive syllogism. Remember, the denial of an attempt to regulate population growth, part 1, part 3, it becomes denied. Part 1 and part 3 of disjunctive syllogism must be denied on the grounds of its relation and the possibility for its regulation to effectively decrease the levels of water contamination. What? Okay, if anyone gets confused, it's what I just said. But this is absolutely important. This argument for disjunctive syllogism is not free-floating. It exists. It is embedded rigorously into an overall argument that was preceded by the hypothetical syllogism. We recognize in the hypothetical syllogism, and I said this before, that we're going to be incorporating disjunctive syllogism after HS for a reason. What's the ultimate goal? Remember, we said that this is ultimately going to be about water quantity preservation and what are